The scent inside Brasserie Léonard was always the same. Warm butter, reduction sauces, and the particular kind of tension that lived in rooms where money moved quietly and egos moved loudly. Hazel Fenwick had worked there long enough to recognize every variation of that tension. The kind that came from a bad review, the kind that came from a kitchen fire, and the worst kind, that arrived in a suit and sat at table 7. She had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon. It was now approaching 9, and the dining room was in full swing, every white-clothed table occupied by the sort of guests who treated a $400 dinner as something owed to them rather than something earned. Hazel moved between the tables with the quiet efficiency that head server Colette had praised on her first week and that the guests barely noticed, which was, she had come to understand, exactly the point. You were not supposed to be noticed. You were supposed to appear. Water glass refilled, bread basket replenished, forgotten fork replaced, as if the restaurant itself were doing it. She didn't mind. She had learned long ago to find a kind of peace in invisibility. What she had never learned to find peace with was cruelty disguised as wit. The man at table 7 arrived at 8:43. His name, she would learn later from the reservation, was Dorian Ashcroft, senior partner at a Bay Street acquisitions firm, which meant he was the kind of man who had long confused the ability to accumulate wealth with the right to dispense contempt. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired in a way that looked deliberately maintained, and he arrived with 2 younger associates who carried themselves like men, practicing how to become him. They were loud from the moment they sat down. Not the jolly loud of people celebrating something, but the performative loud of people who want the room to know they've arrived. Hazel took their order without incident. She recommended the sablefish when asked, explained the provenance of the lamb without overselling it, and filled their glasses before they noticed they were empty. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. The trouble started at the second glass of wine. One of the younger men, round-faced, with a laugh that always arrived a half-second after Dorian's, leaned across the table and said something in a low voice. Whatever it was, Dorian smiled. Not at Hazel, not at the food, at something happening between the 3 of them that they were choosing not to share with the room. She thought nothing of it. Men like that always had their private jokes. She went back to the pass to collect an order for table 11 and was already thinking about the couple at table 3 who had been nursing their dessert wine for 40 minutes and would need a gentle suggestion toward the door. She was thinking about whether the kitchen had the tart tatin she'd promised the woman at table 9. She was thinking, in the way she always was, about a dozen small things at once. She was not thinking about Dorian Ashcroft, but Dorian Ashcroft was thinking about her. When she returned to table 7 with the wine list for the second bottle, she caught the tail end of what he was saying. She didn't react. Her face stayed exactly where she'd trained it to stay, pleasant, present, professionally blank, but something in her chest went very still, the way the air goes still right before weather. He was speaking Ojibwe. Not fluently, not beautifully, in the halting, accented way of someone who had learned a handful of phrases for the purpose of using them in situations exactly like this one. He was telling his associates, in words he believed she could not possibly understand, that the server was too pretty to be this stupid, and that her smile looked like the kind women practiced in bathroom mirrors when they needed to seem agreeable. The younger men laughed. The round-faced one covered his mouth. Hazel set the wine list on the table. She smiled, warm, practiced, entirely controlled. "Take your time," she said, and moved away. In the kitchen, she stood by the expediting station for 30 seconds and looked at the wall. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. She had grown up in Sudbury, in a house that smelled like pine and wood smoke, and her grandmother's baking. Her grandmother, Rosalie, was Anishinaabe, from Wequemkung on Manitoulin Island, and she had been one of those women who seemed to contain entire generations of knowledge in her small frame: how to read weather in the color of the sky, how to dry sage, and how to speak Ojibwe with the kind of precision that made other speakers lean forward when she talked. Hazel's mother was her grandmother's youngest daughter, which made Hazel technically a city girl raised on the edge of something much older and much larger than herself. She had grown up going back and forth, the school year in Sudbury, summers on the island, and her grandmother had insisted on the language the way some grandparents insist on piano lessons. Not cruelly, not rigidly, but with a quiet conviction that suggested she understood something about the world that Hazel did not yet have the years to comprehend. People will underestimate what they can't name. Rosalie had told her once, sitting on the dock while the sun turned the water into hammered copper. Hazel had been 12 and more interested in whether the frogs in the shallows were the same ones she'd seen the summer before. But she'd listened. She always listened to her grandmother, even when she didn't understand why. She understood now. She had not planned on becoming a server. She had started a biology degree at Laurentian, scholarship-funded, earnest, quietly proud, and had been 2 years in when her mother was diagnosed. The bills were not catastrophic at first, and then they were. And Hazel had done the math in the way that people do when the math already has an answer, and they're just looking for a route they can live with. She had left school. She had found the job at Brasserie Léonard through a friend of a friend who'd said the tips were good and the management was decent. Both things turned out to be true. She told herself she would go back. She had been telling herself that for 3 years. In the meantime, she memorized the menu with the same discipline she'd brought to organic chemistry. She learned the wine regions like she'd once learned taxonomic classifications. She became, according to Colette and the regulars, and the half-dozen glowing online reviews that mentioned her by name, one of the best servers the restaurant had seen in years. None of that showed up in Dorian Ashcroft's face when he looked at her. What showed up was the blank appraisal of someone encountering furniture. He did it again at the main course. She was setting down the lamb. His. Because he'd ordered it with the confidence of someone who expected others at the table to take note. And he said something to the round-faced associate that made the man glance up at her and then quickly back down at his plate. Hazel's Ojibwe was not the Ojibwe of ceremonies or of sacred texts. It was the Ojibwe of summer mornings and dock conversations, and her grandmother teaching her the names of things while they walked through the bush. It was domestic and detailed and exact, and what Dorian Ashcroft was saying, in his borrowed, mangled approximation of that language, was that she looked like she couldn't count past 10, and he intended to leave 8%. The third associate, quiet until now, with the watchful look of someone newer to the firm, shifted in his seat. Hazel placed the lamb in front of Dorian with care. She straightened the plate. She asked if there was anything else they needed. She waited for the answer, with her hands folded and her face entirely composed. She was thinking about her grandmother's dock. She was thinking about the phrase Rosalie had used for the particular kind of person who speaks loudly because they've confused volume with authority. There was a word for it, not quite translatable, the way the best Ojibwe expressions resist translation, but it meant something close to a person who fills space they haven't earned. Her grandmother had said it with a kind of tired affection, like a naturalist describing a creature it had taken years to understand. Hazel had nodded at 12. She understood completely now. She refilled the water glasses, and went back to the kitchen. The third and final incident came during dessert. By then, the dining room had thinned. The couple at table 3 had finally left. The woman at table 9 had been delighted by the tart tatin. The room was quieter, and in the way of quiet rooms, voices carried further. Hazel was bringing the cheese board to table 7 when Dorian, glass tilted at a comfortable angle, said something to the round-faced man in Ojibwe that was different in tone from the others, more deliberate. He was watching her as he said it, testing something. He said, "Look at her. She has no idea we could be speaking Martian for all she understands." He said it clearly. He said it slowly. He was, she realized, performing for her without knowing she could see the performance. The round-faced man laughed. The quiet one did not. Hazel set the cheese board on the table. She arranged the accompaniments, the honeycomb, the 2 varieties of preserves, with the unhurried attention she brought to every table. She named the cheeses in order from mildest to sharpest, the way Colette had trained her. She told them about the aged cheddar from Prince Edward County and the soft ash rind from a small producer in Compton, Quebec, and she told them about the honey which came from a family operation north of Kingston. Then she straightened up. She looked at Dorian Ashcroft with the same expression she'd been wearing all evening, warm, professional, perfectly controlled, and she said, in Ojibwe, in her grandmother's dialect, with the particular precision of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. The problem with speaking in a language you believe others cannot hear is that you reveal yourself completely to anyone who can. The silence that followed was of a specific and particular texture. Dorian's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The round-faced man looked at the tablecloth. The quiet one, the third associate, the one who had shifted in his seat at the lamb course, looked at Hazel with an expression that wasn't surprise so much as recognition, as though he'd been waiting to see which way this would go. Hazel held Dorian's gaze for 1 measured second. Then she said, in English at the precise volume of professional service, "I hope you enjoy the cheese. I'll bring the bill when you're ready." She turned and walked back toward the pass. She was in the service corridor when she heard the sound of a chair. Quick footsteps. She turned to find the third associate standing a few feet away, looking slightly flushed. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to." He stopped. Started again. That was my grandmother's language, my kokum. I understood what he was saying, all of it. I should have said something an hour ago, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. His name, he told her, was Damien Odjick. He was 29, and he'd been with the firm for 8 months, and he had been listening to Dorian Ashcroft do versions of this. Not always in Ojibwe, not always this specific, but versions of this since the first week he'd started. Tonight had been the most explicit he'd seen. Hazel looked at him for a moment. He had the earnest, slightly miserable look of someone who had just caught up to something they should have seen sooner. "You don't need to apologize to me," she said, "but what you do next is up to you." Damien Odjick nodded once. He looked at the floor. Then he looked back up. "I have a card in my wallet," he said. "Dorian doesn't know, but our firm's new managing partner. She joined 6 weeks ago. She's been looking very carefully at certain partners' conduct. There are things she needs documented, if tonight is documented." He paused. "I can make sure the right person hears about this." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "The right person doesn't need to hear it from me," she said. "She can hear it from you. You were there." Damien. Odjick took a breath that seemed to reorganize something inside him. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, which he turned over and wrote a number on the back. "This is her direct line," he said, "in case it helps to have a corroborating voice." He went back to the dining room. Hazel stood in the service corridor and held the card for a moment. Then she slipped it into her apron pocket and went to collect the bill. Dorian Ashcroft paid without leaving a tip. She had expected this. He did not look at her again on the way out. The round-faced associate gave the room a single backward glance, the way people do when they're trying to determine whether something happened or whether they imagined it. Damien Odjick paused at the door and gave Hazel a look she could not entirely read, part apology, part something firmer, and then followed the others into the street. Hazel cleared table 7 with the methodical attention she brought to every closing task. She stacked the side plates. She collected the linen. She noted, in the brief interval before the busser arrived, that Dorian Ashcroft had eaten his lamb down to the bone, consumed most of a bottle of Burgundy, and helped himself to 3 of the 5 cheeses on the board. He had enjoyed himself enormously. He had left without the smallest acknowledgement that the person who had made that evening function had a name, a history, a grandmother who had taught her to count stars in 2 languages. She was almost done clearing the table when Colette appeared at her shoulder. "Table 11 is asking for you specifically," Colette said. "The woman says you recommended a wine last month that changed her life." Hazel set the napkins in the linen bin. "I'll go now." "Also," Colette added in a different tone, "who was the man you were talking to in the corridor?" "A guest," Hazel said. Colette waited. "He had something to tell me," Hazel said. "I think he needed to say it." Colette looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a woman who has run a dining room for 14 years and therefore understands that there are conversations that happen at tables and conversations that happen in corridors, and that the ones in corridors often matter more. "Go see table 11, she said. She called the number on the card 3 days later, not impulsively, not in the heat of anything. She called after a Tuesday shift, sitting at her kitchen table in her apartment on Dalhousie Street, with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and the late light coming through the window at the particular angle that always made her think of the island. The woman who answered was named Vivienne Osey. Hazel had looked her up, managing partner, 15 years in corporate litigation, before moving to a governance role, the kind of professional trajectory that was described in trade publications as distinguished, and by people who knew her as formidable. She answered on the second ring and listened to Hazel without interrupting, which was itself a kind of signal. When Hazel finished, Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "Damien called me the same night," she said. "He also sent written notes. He was thorough." Hazel said she was glad. "I want you to understand something," Vivienne continued. "What Dorian Ashcroft did is part of a pattern I've been documenting for 6 weeks. Your account adds a dimension I didn't have. The specificity of the language, the deliberateness of choosing a language he assumed you couldn't speak, that speaks to intent in a way that other incidents don't." She paused. "You don't have to do anything further if you prefer not to, but I want you to know that your account has been heard and it will be used." Hazel looked at the window. The light was going. "I'd like to provide a written account," she said. "If that's useful." "It's very useful," Vivienne said. They spoke for another 20 minutes. At the end of the call, Vivienne said something that Hazel would think about for a long time afterward. She said, "He chose a language to make himself invisible." "You knew the language. That tends to be the variable people like him forget to account for." Hazel thanked her and set the phone down. She thought about her grandmother, sitting on the dock in the copper evening light, looking at the water, with the patience of someone who understood that most things that seemed like certainties were only things that hadn't been tested yet. People will underestimate what they can't name. She had been 12 when Rosalie said it. She had been sitting on the dock, half listening, thinking about frogs. She understood it now entirely. Dorian Ashcroft's departure from the firm was announced in a brief internal memo 8 weeks later. The language used was the careful, neutral language of institutional communications, pursuing other opportunities, mutual decision, grateful for contributions. Damien Odjick forwarded it to Hazel without comment. She read it once. Then she set her phone face down on the kitchen table and went back to the textbook she'd taken out of the library the week before, a third-year ecology course text, somewhat out of date now, but structurally sound, which she was working through in the hour between her shift ending and her body convincing itself it was time to sleep. She had not gone back to school yet. She wasn't certain when she would. Her mother's health had stabilized in the past several months, which changed the financial calculation in ways she was still working out. The scholarship she'd left behind was gone, obviously, but there were others, and she had started making inquiries with a focus and a patience that the biology department advisor, who had responded with more warmth than she'd expected, had described over email as refreshingly specific. She would go back. She had always known she would go back. The question of when had simply been a matter of conditions, and conditions were beginning, slowly, to shift. On the dock in Weequem Coong, in her memory, her grandmother was still sitting, still watching the water, still entirely certain of something she had not yet put into words, waiting for Hazel to grow up enough to hear it. The late shift started at 4. The linen at Brasserie Leonard would be pressed, and the wine would be at temperature, and the guests would arrive expecting a particular kind of perfection, which Hazel would provide with a competence they would almost certainly not name, and perhaps not notice. That was fine. She had stopped waiting to be noticed by people who were not paying attention. She had her grandmother's language in her mouth like something solid, like something with roots, and she had learned in a dining room on a Tuesday night that the thing about carrying a language no one expects you to know is that it will wait. It will wait as long as it needs to. And when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, it will be ready.